Perfect. Okay, well, hello everyone. So great to be with you here tonight or this morning, depending on where you sit. We welcome David Pulsipher with us today, and I'm really glad to have him with us as part of this Euroseminar webinar. He will speak to us on the topic of conflict and peace in our time, and on principles and practices from the standpoint of the Latter-day Saints. It's a topic very dear to my heart. I studied peace and conflict resolution at my university back in the day. So I'm really excited to be here and to listen to David. But before I get ahead of myself, we'll start this as we always do with a prayer, and we've asked Richard Sleegers to give that prayer for us.
Yes. Our dear Father in heaven, we are so grateful to come together through this digital means to share ideas with one another and to learn. So please, Father, send us thy spirit that we may be open to learn, that we may have ears to hear and eyes to see what thou would want us to see. And we thank you for the friends that we have that are engaged in this great work of salvation and of the gathering of Israel, that we may all do our part, and that we may work towards more peace in this world, and to do our part in that, and that we may be granted with new and fresh ideas today from the presentation, to do that each in our own sphere of influence. And if there are others that are still on their way to join, please that they may be nudged to do so. And this thing we pray in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Richard. Perfect. Just as a way of updates from the Euroseminar, we've had these webinars on and off. We try to put them on our YouTube channel and create more, good content for all the young professional Latter-day Saints here in Europe. But the main body of what the Euroseminar is or has been in the past is a physical gathering. And since this is already our 10th anniversary year now, 2024, there will of course be another in-person Euroseminar this year. And we'll announce that it will be in Prague again, as we had it 2 times previously, this summer from July 17th to the 20th. So there will be more information as to topics and speakers and registration forthcoming, but you can already note that date down in your calendars. Now to
hiding.
Now to today's webinar. Last year we all gathered in Rome, and we talked about things like humanitarian aid, human rights, the future of the church in Europe, and the future of Europe in general. And there was a book that was frequently mentioned by speakers and participants, and it was Proclaim Peace. And we knew one of the authors, Patrick Mason. We had him in the previous Euroseminar session with us, but we didn't know the other author, David Pulsipher. But since it went around so much, actually Grant and I think it was Grant, you initiated the idea that, to do a book club, to just meet on some regular basis to just go over the book chapter by chapter in the fall. I can't say that we were very successful in creating a cohesive group, but we had good connections the few times we were able to meet and discuss the things that we had read. So we, initially thought, well, it would be great to have a chat with David, and it's like, okay, learn more from him, or just have him in the last session of our book club. But then, it grew into the idea to invite David to a webinar session of the Euroseminar. So here we are tonight, and without taking too much time, we'll have Grant introduce David now, and then we'll turn over the time to David for his presentation. And if there's questions, you can either send them to me in the chat during the presentation or just ask them at the end. There will probably be some time for question and answer. But yeah, Grant, please go ahead.
All right. I will be brief because I want to hear as much from David as possible. But Dr. Pulsipher got his bachelor's in American Studies at BYU and his PhD in American Studies at the University of Minnesota. He's been teaching at Ricks College, which is now BYU Idaho, since 1997. And through all of his studies of American Studies, there's always been kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but always a leaning towards peace building and those causes. You can kind of see it throughout his life, his mission in rural Pennsylvania, where you're surrounded by a lot of different peace-loving peoples like the Mennonites and the Amish, and up through years later when he was a Fulbright scholar at Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi, India, walking in the footsteps of Gandhi. And a lot of his research is focused on the intersection of Latter-day Saint history, theology, and peace building and nonviolence. He is the author of multiple books. Two of the ones that are perhaps the most relevant here are When We Don't See Eye to Eye, Using the Weapons of Love to Overcome Anger and Aggression, and, as mentioned earlier, co-authoring Proclaim Peace, The Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict. On a personal level, I've known David my whole life, and I did call up your son to see what I should say, and we talked about how David has always been in a family full of very strong opinions, an extended family full of very strong opinions. David has always seemed to gravitate more towards the mediation of discussions and the fair arguments rather than forcing his own point, which has been both relieving to me and his son tells me sometimes frustrating when he wants to pick a fight with his dad. But definitely become kind of an expert on peace building, especially in these contexts. So I will hand things over to Dr. Pulsipher.
Well, thank you, Grant. I knew it was going to be dangerous having you introduce me since you did have access to the family. But it's really just an honor to be invited to be part of this. I've been aware of Euroseminar for years and just the great work that I think has been done and the wonderful people that you have that you've invited to speak. So I'm just honored for the invitation to be here. And I guess we can begin with just something that may seem like a really fairly cliched thing to say, especially every day it seems to become more cliche. We're living in an era of conflict, right? We're living in an era of increasingly unhealthy conflict. And I think conflicts, the more I talk to people, the more I'm realizing how much conflict is affecting people's lives on a very intimate level. And a lot of the principles that we study in conflict and peace studies are principles that apply in very personal, intimate context, conflicts between people, and all the way up to the scale of nations. And so I'm hoping that some of the things we'll talk about today will be useful to each of you in the particular conflicts that you might be struggling with in one form or another. I've kind of leaned towards the practical today. I'm increasingly, my wife tells me this. I'll give a presentation and she'll say, "You didn't give them the so what? Like, what do we do? How do we operationalize what you've just talked about?" I tend to really get excited about the theories, and so more and more, though, I'm inclined when having an opportunity to do these kinds of presentations to talk about what are some really practical things that people can do and take away. So This is going to be a little less theoretical, a little more practical. And so I want to begin by just asking the question of those of you that are here, what are the kinds of conflicts that are causing you the most trouble in your lives? What are they large scale conflicts that you worry about? Are they small conflicts with other people? Anybody, maybe just give me I would love to hear the kinds of conflict, because when we're talking about conflict and peace, we can be talking, people can often assume we're talking about massive conflicts like what's happening in Ukraine or between nations, or people can be thinking in terms of the trouble that they're having with a coworker or a family member. So what kinds of conflicts, let's just get a sense of which kinds of conflicts you're interested in hearing about. That will help me shape a little bit of what we're going to talk about, but also I'm hoping we can demonstrate that the principles can apply to all kinds of conflicts.
Let me start, David. How about conflicts within our conscience? Being bombarded with information left and right, and you have to negotiate your life, your way through all this.
Yeah, internal conflict. I often have our students do what we call a personal conflict analysis, where they're supposed to analyze a conflict in their life. And more students are saying, "Can I just talk about how I'm in conflict with myself?" And then the kinds of conflicts that emerge from competing ideas, competing loyalties, competing. Those conflicts can be just within us and not with anybody out exterior to us. Any other kinds of conflicts that you're wrestling with?
In the chat, there are already some questions.
I'm very bad at looking at the chat, so I'm going to make sure Eric keeps me focused on that.
I can also so for me, what I said, for me, mostly it's individual conflicts with individual people. Often it's people close to me. I'm doing better with family by now. But I feel like work is still like with colleagues, that's often something that comes up. Mm-hmm. Just because we work close together, there's issues, they just arise naturally. And then what Elizabeth has written, she says, is also interpersonal and close personal relationships. And then Grant also says, there's a lot of conflict between the experienced employee and the new leadership. So, when there's changes in leadership, when there's distrust and, people feeling unappreciated, that there's causes for conflict.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I was just typing it up, but I can also say it.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, let's just.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat, but it's about people canceling each other. And what stuns me is that even when there is, so to say, also only the slightest discord, it is just easy to turn away, break the relationship, and slip off into anonymity or go away. And of course, when our society allows more anonymity, and as in my case, the workplace is very large, there are 1,500 people working there and stuff like that, then it becomes more easy to just leave, which I think leads to an unhealthy way of dealing with conflict. And the example from pedagogy is it's the best way to learn conflict with your own siblings, because they will never go away. They will always stay in your close family. And so you have to resolve the discord. But if you are with friends or other people from your class or your same age group, and the next year you're done with school, and you can walk away.
All right. Yeah, it's interesting the way you're talking about the way we cancel each other and whether we just walk away or we unfriend them or we or we don't invite them to speak. I mean, yeah, that I think, and increasingly it seems, at least in my experience, and I'd be interested to know how much this is happening in Europe. It's certainly happening here in the United States, but it's political differences and more than anything that are starting to drive wedges between people. Do you have a similar kind of dynamic that's happening in Europe, or is it's amazing to me how much different political tribes have created conflicts within families, and so on. What's the general? Craig's got his hand up, so.
That's the sentiment I was just typing, David, about the polarization of society by political leaders.
Mm-hmm.
I'm here in the UK, and there's a big drive, just like there is in the States. We've probably seen similar polarization effect between white and left wing sort of politics, the woke narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and it's driving strong contention on matters of about immigration, about social state support, benefit living for those who are unable to get to the workplace, public services, etc. And so that's driving a big conflict. And frustratingly, I'm a bishop here in a small ward. Bringing to the church narrative, sometimes that bleeds into church relationships as well, which I find highly frustrating, because that is obviously not the Christian or the church's principles. But it just goes to show how ingrained it's becoming in wider society.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that is certainly it's been my case, observing here too in the United States. Is it's been troubling to watch the ways in which the larger societal conflicts are bleeding into congregations and into families and splitting very long-term relationships that are suffering as a result of some of that. So thank you for bringing that perspective in. I appreciate that. Well, anyone else that wants to, before we get, I'm going to share my screen here in a second. Anyone? Yes.
One thing has been striking to me, as was just expressed, of course, the fact that people tend to be more polarized on every aspects of life and politics and society and so on. And certainly each time I turn on the TV to listen to the news or to some discussion, it's not a discussion, it's a way of conflict. But what has been striking is the fact that rarely do I feel there is a real rational approach to the problems, but they very quickly seem to be much more of the level of how could I express its feelings? It's not so much looking for the right answer, for the truth, but just much more a reaction which is very emotional, very psychological, and there is little hope for a real discussion and a real solution when you talk sometimes at the level of almost faith. I believe that, and there is no way you're going to change my mind. That's my belief. That's my conviction. That's my and it's really irrational sometimes, and it seems to me that it's hard to find a way out of this kind of attitude and position.
Thank you. Yeah, these are all, this is very very helpful, because it sounds to me like your problems aren't much different in Europe than they are here in the United States in terms of the kinds of emotional challenging. And I think it comes down to, we don't know, and we're increasingly losing our capacity to engage in conflict in ways that are healthy and that can move us forward. So let me begin with I'm going to share my screen here just a second. I don't do two things at once very well. I'm very much. All right, can everybody see that okay? Okay. One of the biggest challenges that I think we increasingly have is this sense that conflict is a bad thing. And so one of the most important things we work with our students here at BYU Idaho, and generally in peace studies overall, we were actually talking a little earlier before this started about the different terms that have emerged in conflict and peace studies. We used to talk about conflict management, and then it became conflict resolution, and now increasingly in conflict and peace studies, we don't talk about either of those. We talk about conflict transformation. And that is...
Sorry, it's not loading for us. We saw it, but when you went into full screen mode, it's still the loading sign there.
Oh, no, dear. Okay, well, that could create us a big problem. Let's try this again. Was it showing before when I...
Yeah, it was showing.
Okay, let's see if I can... let me see if I can make that work. Thank you for letting me know. Okay. All right, let's go back and try this one more time. Okay, you can see that, right? Okay.
Yes.
Well, if we have to, we'll just do it in this. It's my least favorite way to do a presentation, but we can do it if we have to. But let me try one more time, see if you can see it when we go to... Has it loaded yet?
No. Still the black screen with like the loading ...
Sto ascoltando le...
Yeah, it says that my screen sharing is paused. Why is it doing that? Okay, well. Okay, we're going to go out. So if I do this, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll just do it this way. See if we can get a better view. But...
Posso chiederti una cosa?
Okay, well, there we are. You can see what the coming slides are to the left as we go. All right, no surprises here. So one of the biggest challenges that we have is the problem of having a fear of conflict. One of the things that I think is most interesting for us as Latter-day Saints is that, as a rule, Latter-day Saints are really good conflict avoiders because we have this fear of conflict. And part of this comes from our own, I think, misreading of our own sacred text. So people will often refer to Jesus's instructions to the Nephites when he comes to saying, contention is not of me, right? Contention is of the devil. And we take the word contention and we substitute in the word conflict, and we say that conflict, therefore, must not be of God. Contention is a very specific form of conflict, I believe, is the way it's being used by the Savior there. It's an unhealthy form of conflict. But if we start looking at our scriptures a little more carefully, we begin to realize that conflict is built in from the very beginning. It's an inevitable part of the universe, and it's actually the engine of creation. So if we think to the creation stories, and as Latter-day Saints, we have 4 versions of those stories. We've got one in Genesis, we've got one in Moses, we've got one in Abraham, and we have one in the temple ceremony. And in every one of those, and getting it 4 times, I think means that we ought to be paying closer attention to some of the lessons that it has. And they're not always the lessons that are obvious. And one of the lessons that I think is really important to understand in these creation stories is the idea that creation is a form of division. God divides the light from the darkness. God divides the land from the water. God divides day and night. And in the process of dividing things, once you begin to divide things, you automatically put them into some sort of tension with one another, especially when there is, in some form or another, opposite to one another. And putting water and land into conflict with one another is actually the creative engine that creates the world. It creates mountains, it creates rivers, it creates seascapes, and it's the places that we're drawn to. At least I am constantly drawn to the mountains that have been created by the endless pounding of water against rock that has then created canyons and carved out peaks and glaciers that have done the same thing, or sitting on the going to the seashore and watching the waves crashing against the rocks, or just lapping up on the sand. It's these places of conflict where these two elements of land and water are in constant tension with one another that are the most beautiful and the most creative places in the world. And if you think about this, you begin thinking about it for much longer, and you begin to realize that conflict is at the heart of music. The tension of a bow on the string, the tension of two notes with one another, the pounding of drums, whatever it might be. There is a very active element of conflict that's at the heart of music. It's the heart of art, negative space and positive space and contrast and so on. It's at the heart of everything beautiful and worthwhile in the world. So conflict is not the problem. And the problem is what we do with the conflict. So if conflict is inevitable, and if it's the engine of creation, one of the things that we have to begin to appreciate is that even some of the most intense conflicts that we have can be creative, and it depends on how we engage that conflict, not whether we're going to have that conflict. We're going to have conflicts in our relationships. We're going to have conflicts at work. We're going to have conflicts in our family. We're going to have conflicts between nations and political groups, and all of those things are inevitable. How we engage the conflict is the key. And what becomes the key is how can we transform those conflicts from destructive forms into creative forms of conflict. And that's what I want to really focus on today, is the how. Because ultimately, when we talk about peace, most of the time people think of peace as the absence of conflict. That's actually not the way it's defined in peace studies. Peace studies defines peace, and this is a definition given by probably the founder of peace, often considered the founder of peace studies, Johan Galtung, Norwegian scholar, sociologist, who defined peace as the absence of violence. Now, the absence of conflict and the absence of violence are two very different things. Violence is unhealthy conflict. Violence is conflict that creates harm. It's not the absence of conflict. So how do we achieve peace, which means how do we transform our conflicts from unhealthy conflicts to healthy conflicts? And I'm going to say something that's going to seem very cliche, but the answer is right in front of us, and it's been there all along. It's there in the Old Testament, it's there in the New Testament, and it's certainly there specifically in the teachings of Jesus. And that is something very simple but very hard, and that is to love your enemies. Love is the heart of conflict transformation. And it's not this mystical, magical kind of thing. It's actually some very practical and even explainable dynamics that go on with love that help us understand why love is essential to transforming all of our conflicts. Probably the hardest saying that Jesus ever gave was this at the end of Matthew chapter 5 and at the end of 3rd Nephi chapter 12, when he says, you have heard, to love your, hate your enemies and love your neighbors and hate and love your friends. But Jesus gives us a much deeper and higher key. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you. Now, again, very simple, but not very easy to do. But ultimately, it's the essential ingredient. And until we can truly love our enemies, our conflicts will continue to be destructive and harmful, not only to ourselves, but to others. So what does it mean to love your enemies? And are there any kind of practical ways that we can do that? And that's what I want to spend most of the rest of the time talking about. I'm hoping I can show you this video, but let me just first talk about the dynamic that's going on with loving your enemies. It's actually a very simple psychological concept that I think is just probably one of the most important ideas that's come out of modern psychology. It's the idea of complementarity. So let me just talk a little bit about complementary. You don't get to see all the fun animations here that I had, so you'll just get to see the final product that emerges. But if you've ever found yourself in a conversation and somebody folds their arms, and the person you're talking to, and you find yourself folding your arms as well, right? Or they lean in and you lean in, they laugh, you laugh. We are designed, hardwired even as human beings, to connect. And one of the most important ways that we are designed to connect is to mirror. It's the way we connect to other people. We mirror, and it's the way we drive each other away as well. We'll talk about that in a second. But we are designed to reflect back what people are doing to us. And it's called complementarity in psychological terms. And that works really great when people are being kind to us, right? People who are kind to us, we naturally respond in kind. We respond with the same kindness, and it actually can create over long term wonderful virtuous cycles of increasing affection and connection and trust between two individuals. So it's absolutely essential to our most basic relationships, but it also can be used in a very destructive way. So when somebody is snippy with us, or they begin to ignore us, or in whatever other form of hostile behavior they might engage in, we tend to respond in a complementary way. Now that can be they're cold to us, we're cold to them. They're angry with us, we're angry with them. Or a complementary response can actually be someone's angry with us and we're cold back. This doesn't mean that you're mirroring the exact behavior, but you're complementing that behavior in a way that that matches it to one degree or another. When we give up on a relationship and walk away from it, that's a complementary response. When we fight back in a relationship, when someone's fighting with us, that's a complementary response. It tends to increase the negative behavior in the other side. If you want to really get in kind of a deeper dive into how all of that works in terms of interpersonal relationships, I would recommend to you the work of Terry Warner and the bonds that make us free. Our Bonds That Make Us Free, and then work from the Arbinger Institute, which has taken his ideas. He was a philosophy professor at BYU who got into how we engage in what he calls collusion, where we're actually complementing each other's responses and calling forth the very thing we don't like in the other person by the things that we're doing and the ways that we're responding to them. So those are complementary responses. So the big key is to transforming unhealthy conflict like this into something healthier, like the previous form of complementary responses, is this idea of non-complementarity. The non-complementary response, that is where someone is being angry with us and we respond with kindness, with love. That's a non-complementary response. It can go the other way, where you're extending love to somebody and they respond in a hostile way back. That's also a non-complementary response. But for our purposes here, we want to talk about the ways in which it can transform it the other direction. And this is at the heart of all peace building. It's at the heart of peace building between two spouses, and it is the essence of peace building between two nations. It's when the one side or the other responds in a non-complementary way, when they get out of the unhealthy cycle and respond in some way that breaks the cycle. And actually what it does is it flips complementarity to the advantage of peace. When someone is angry and we respond with love, they are hardwired to respond back with a reflective response, right? A reflective response of love in some form or other. And then it flips the script, the ways that people were expecting things to go, and it takes us in a new direction. I think the classic example of this in Latter-day Saint scriptures is the anti-Nephi Lehis, who respond to enormous aggression and lethal force with love and with prayer. And in the process, they transform significant numbers of the attackers, who suddenly are left kind of naked in their aggression, exposed without any justification for what they're doing, and throw down their weapons and are converted and join the people they had just recently, just moments before, thought of as enemies, are now people that they want to associate and connect to. Right? It's one of the most remarkable stories in all the sacred scripture. When I go to conflict, when I go outside of Latter-day Saint circles and talk to other people, and especially in other faith communities, and tell them the story of the anti-Nephi Lehis, they're just blown away. They think it's such a wonderful story. They think it must be central to everything we talk about because, of course, they tend to be peace builders and they're looking for those kinds of stories. They say, that's a fantastic story. You need to share that with more people. And I say, yes, we do. We're doing all our best to share that story with as many people as we can. But it's the classic story of non-complementarity. And it does a great job. Now, I'm going to see if we can get this to work. I want you to give a sense of how this can work out in what would ordinarily be a horrible situation. I'm going to actually see. I don't know if this will play from the slide. Let's see. Oh, good. Were you hearing that? Okay. All right. So let me just set this up. This is the story of Julia Diaz, who was a social worker in New York City in the Bronx. He was coming home from work one day. Seems to have had a regular routine of going to a restaurant near his train stop. And as he's getting off the train, and you'll hear him describe this in his own words, he's held up at knife point and robbed. So he's mugged. Everybody's kind of worst nightmare going to a new place or a city is that idea of getting mugged. It's the way he responds that transforms things here. This is a wonderful example of a non-complementary response. So I'm just going to let him tell his own story.
So I get off the train, I'm walking towards the stairs, and this young teenager pulls out a knife. He wants my money. So I just gave him my wallet and told him, here you go. He starts to leave, and as he's walking away, I'm like, hey, wait a minute, you forgot something. If you're going to be robbing people for the rest of the night, you might as well take my coat to keep you warm. So, he's looking at me like, what's going on here, and he asked me, well, why are you doing this? And I'm like, well, I don't know, man, if you're willing to risk your freedom for a few dollars, then I guess you must really need the money. I mean, all I wanted to do was go get dinner, and if you really want to join me, hey, you're more than welcome. So I'm like, look, you can follow me if you want. I just felt maybe he really needs help. So, we go into the diner where I normally eat. We sit down in the booth, and the manager comes by, the dishwashers come by, the waiters come by to say hi. So the kid was like, man, but you know everybody here. Do you own this place? I'm like, no, I just eat here a lot. He's like, but you're even nice to the dishwasher. I'm like, well, haven't you been taught you should be nice to everybody? So he's like, yeah, but I didn't think people actually behave that way. So I just asked him in the end, I'm like, what is it that you want out of life? He just had almost a sad face. Either he couldn't answer me or he didn't want to. The bill came, and I look at him and I'm like, look, I guess you're going to have to pay for this bill because you have my money and I can't pay for this. So if you give me my wallet back, I'll gladly treat you. He didn't even think about it. He's like, yeah, okay, here you go. So I got my wallet back. And I gave him $20 for it. I figure maybe it'll help him. I don't know. And when I gave him the $20, I asked him to give me something in return, which was his knife. And he gave it to me. It's funny because when I told my mom about what happened, no mom wants to hear this, but with her, she was like, well, you're the type of kid that always someone asked you for the time, you gave them your watch. I don't know, I figure, you treat people right, you can only hope that they treat you right. It's as simple as it gets in this complicated world.
Okay, so kind of a remarkable story, right? It feels remarkable in part because I think most of us, that's not the way we would naturally respond, right? But Julio responds with the non-complimentary response. He does what is unexpected. If he had just given him his wallet and walked away, that would have been a complimentary response. If he'd pulled out a knife and tried to grab the knife, that would have been a complimentary response too, if he'd fought him in some way. Instead, he says, "Take my coat." Does that seem reminiscent of anything from our own tradition? I mean, in essence, it's the Sermon on the Mount, right? If a man sues you at the law for one piece of clothing, you give him another piece of clothing, right? I can never remember if it's the coat or the cloak, but anyway, which comes first. But he's in essence living out the Sermon on the Mount. He's loving his enemy. And it's a very unusual way of responding, but it transforms the whole situation and it transforms this young man, at least for that evening, hopefully longer than that as well. That's the key to peace building. That's the key to transforming our conflicts. It's not as if he and the young men were now all unified and of one heart and one mind. There's still important differences, but they've transformed this conflict into something healthier from the destructive conflict that it was. All right, so how can we do this? What are some ways we can actually learn the art of the non-complimentary response? How can we become like what Jesus asks us to be able to love our enemies? And the first step in this is to see people who are opponents to us, whether those are family members or coworkers or a kid on the street with a knife, to see them as people rather than as objects. This again goes back to the work of Terry Warner and the Arbinger Institute, which I would highly recommend to you. Wonderful book called The Anatomy of Peace, which kind of condenses some of these ideas. But it's the idea that when we're in conflict with another person, or when we are feeling conflict towards a whole group of people that we don't even know, maybe another political party or a politician, when we are in conflict and when our hearts are in conflict with them, we don't see them as people. We see them as objects. Those objects can take many different forms. We can see them as obstacles to something that we want. We can see them as vehicles to get what we want. We're using them to achieve a certain end. or we see them as just completely irrelevant to our lives. We don't see them at all because they're not meaningful to us in any way. So to transform a conflict, we begin by choosing, and it is a choice, to see other people as people and not in an objectified way. How do we do that? That's a really important thing to do, because when we're in the midst of it, when our emotions are high, it's really hard to do this, because the anger or the frustration or the discouragement that we're feeling begins to color the way that we're seeing this person that is in conflict with us. One of the most instructive ideas that I've heard comes from a man named John Lewis, who was a leader in the civil rights movement for Black equality in the United States. He later became a U.S. congressman, and he was on the front lines of the efforts for Black equality. He was sitting at the lunch counters. He was being beaten and jailed and sworn at and spit upon. And so if anybody kind of knows what it's like to be in the midst of really abusive conflict, it's John Lewis. And John Lewis gave this advice to those who are trying to see their opponents as people. He said, one method of practicing this approach when faced with a hateful, angry, aggressive, even despicable person is to imagine that person, actually visualize him or her as an infant, as a baby. If you can see this full-grown attacker who faces you as the pure, innocent child that he or she once was, that we all once were, it is not hard to find compassion in your heart. It's an interesting idea. You have to kind of separate yourself from the conflict and begin to see them as that innocent child that they once were. We can do this with people that we know from childhood. Parents can do this with their children when they're in conflict. They can remember them as the sweet children they once were and try to, or you can do this with, siblings. It's harder to do when you don't know the person but if you can still imagine them in that kind of pure state. As Latter-day Saints, we can remember and try to choose to see them as a child of God, to see them as someone that God loves as much as that he loves us. Because usually when we're in conflict, we think God loves us more and hates the other. And that's one of the ways in which we justify our conflicts. And you see this time and again through the scriptures and through history. And then, unfortunately, I've seen it time and again in my own personal life, the ways in which when I'm in conflict and I'm feeling self-righteous about my own position, I'm not seeing them as someone God loves. I'm not seeing them as people. I'm seeing them as objects who are in my way or in the way of some cause that I believe in or whatever it might be. So one of the very first and probably one of the hardest steps in this process is to see the other people to see the opponents as people. Any questions on this before we go to number 2? Okay, so that's the first step. Step number 2, be curious and consider I'll explain the decency hypothesis in a second, but I want to focus on the first part of that. Once we can see the opponents as people, the next, hopefully, natural response is, why are they doing what they're doing? Why do they believe what they believe? Why are they saying what they're saying? The things that have been frustrating us so much in the conflict, we have to, if we begin to ask the question, why would a decent person, why would a child of God, why would a good person do what they're doing? And to be curious about that, not just in a way of saying, how did they become so deluded, but to say, how are they seeing this themselves, and what are they doing, and why would they do it? The decency hypothesis is something that came from a professor at BYU named Don Jarvis. He was a professor of Russian there for many, many years, and I think a mission president also. at one point. The last years of his life at BYU, he headed the faculty center there. And when he retired, the faculty center newsletter published his kind of parting letter to his colleagues. For some reason here at Ricks College in BYU, Idaho, we were getting copies of the faculty center newsletter from BYU. And I read this letter of his, and this one paragraph just really stood out to me. He said, usually, he was talking about the divides that happen between faculty and administration, right? This happens in every organization, right? What we call the evil plot twist, right? They're doing this because of these horrible things that they're doing. They just want our life to be painful, whatever it might be. Happens in all sorts of organizations. It happens in families. It happens in marriages. And Don Jarvis gave this advice. It usually pays to attribute good motives to others. Occasionally, people will prove themselves dastardly. But when someone does something suspicious, see if you can't invent some reason why a decent person might have behaved that way, behaved like that. Allow at least a little research before rejecting the decency hypothesis. And I found this to be a very useful guide in all sorts of conflicts. Why, being curious, why would a decent person believe or say or do what they just did? What's the good reason that they have for behaving in this particular manner? And once we can get outside of our own sense of self-righteousness and begin asking why another good person would do something that they've done, it starts to create a dynamic in which more creative conflict can emerge, right? I think it's important here to just emphasize that most conflicts are actually between two good things. In the same way that creation is, and the forces of creation of water and land are the forces of two good things. You don't say, water is the righteous force and land is the unrighteous force, is evil. But when we get in our conflicts with other people, we tend to take the good-evil dynamic. And yet most of our conflicts are also in our personal lives and in our societies are actually conflicts between two good values, two good ideologies, two good intentions. So once we can move away from the evil plot twist and start asking why would a good person do that or subscribe to this idea, what can I understand? That puts us back into that realm of good and the conflict that's happening. Now, that leads us to number 3. Follow what we here at BYU Idaho teach our students. We call it the Wood Principle. The Wood Principle is the idea that you can restate the other side in their strongest possible way. We get this from Robert S. Wood, who was a general authority, and prior to his life as a general authority, later became president of the Boston Temple. But prior to this, he was a political scientist and had lots of opportunities to be involved in all sorts of interesting conflicts, political conflicts, and analyzing conflicts. And in his last general conference talk in April of 2006, he gave a wonderful talk called Instruments of the Lord's Peace. I would highly recommend it to anybody to read, in which he talks about how do we, he first calls us out and says, how often are we falling into the negative types of conflict that exist in the world, and how often are we drawing ourselves into seeing our opponents as evil, and how can we overcome that? And he gave a principle from his time as a graduate student in political science, where he had a disagreement with a philosopher. From his talk, he says, I recall that as a graduate student, I wrote a critique of an important political philosopher. I have no idea which one he's talking about, but somebody he didn't agree with. It was clear I disagreed with him. My professor told me my paper was good, but not good enough. Before you launch into your criticism, she said, you must first present the strongest case for the position you're opposing, one that the philosopher himself could accept. I don't have the rest of the quote here, but he goes on to say that as he did that, he began to appreciate the strengths of the philosopher's position. He still disagreed with the philosopher, but he could see the strengths of their position, and it became a principle that he's tried to follow the rest of his life. There's a couple of things that happen when we can do this, and this is a very hard thing to do because most of the time when we're in an argument or we're in a conflict, what we do is we take the other side's position and we create the weakest version of that position that we can make so that we can easily knock it down. Known in debate as creating a straw man, right? You create the straw man for the other side, and then it's really easy to, and you see this all the time in social media, you see this all the time on television, and in news programs and others. They create the most absurd version of the other side so that it's really easy to dismiss it. The Wood principle says if you're going to make a criticism, if you're going to offer an alternative, then you have to first present the strongest case, or what we call the steel man. You have to create the steel man argument. You have to create that. You have to be able to, and it does a couple of things. One is it allows you first to see the strengths of the other side's argument. But even more important than that, when somebody hears their own case being presented back to them in the strongest possible way, they feel heard. They feel understood and recognized. Even if you don't agree with their position, if you can take the time and honestly respect them well enough to try to understand what it is that they are arguing for, or what they fear, or what they hope for, it means that you're seeing them as a person and not as an object, that you've considered the decency hypothesis, and you can now reflect back to them their own argument in a way that they recognize and say, you get it. You understand me. You see me. Right? And that is, again, the non-complimentary response. Most people do not take the time to really understand the other side's argument and be able to state it to them in a way that they recognize. All right, so that's number 3. Number 4 is to choose to, so if you choose to see people as people, be curious and consider the decency hypothesis, follow the Wood principle, and number 4, leave room for one of my favorite principles, the idea of holy envy. I'm sure that many of you have probably run across this. It comes from the former Bishop of Stockholm, Christer Stendahl, who advocated for the idea that you should be able to engage people that you don't agree with in a way that you can have a certain envy for things that they believe and do, even when you don't believe or have those principles yourself. For him, the principle he would use would be the principle of baptisms for the dead and with the Latter-day Saints. He has holy envy for the beauty and can see the beauty and the power of that ordinance. Personally, I have holy envy for a professional clergy. I go into other faiths and I listen to a professional clergy, somebody who has been trained on how to write and deliver a really powerful sermon that weaves scripture and philosophy and poetry together and inspires you to go out and to be better. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, we have 11-year-olds giving sermons, right, in our churches. And I love that. I don't want a professional clergy in our Latter-day Saint tradition. I love that 11-year-olds are stumbling their way through a talk and sharing a simple testimony. It's beautiful. But I have a little holy envy for the other way of doing it, which is giving it over to a professional. I see and recognize the beauty of what that represents. So that's what we mean by holy envy. Can you see in the other person and in their position and with whatever it is that you're disagreeing with, can you see something that's beautiful? Can you look for that beauty and even acknowledge that beauty as part of restating their case and be able to say, you know, I really appreciate your commitment to this idea or to this future that you're hoping for. I have a different view and I have a different hope. but I really appreciate and find it beautiful what you are trying to do here. So it's when we can leave room. You're not always going to be able to find it, but leave room for it to be able to find that. And when we can do those four things, and we begin to practice them, the non-complementary response is not something that is just automatic. These are ways of training ourselves to do the non-complementary response. Julio Diaz did not just emerge out of nowhere and suddenly know how to respond to this young man who was trying to rob him. I think as a social worker, he'd already spent years working with people probably like his attacker, and he was already inclined to see the young man as a person instead of as an object. There's a wonderful story that I would recommend to you from 1992 that Elder Oaks gives about being mugged in Chicago, in which he has a very similar experience where he sees, he has this moment where he begins to see that his life and this young man's life are connected to one another. He starts to see the young man as a person instead of as an object who is making his life difficult and threatening it. And it transforms the conflict that happens there. It's in a talk called Personal Protection and Bible Stories and Personal Protection from 1992. And he shares that encounter. One of the things that you discover about non-complementary responses, two things that I want to kind of maybe end with. One is that the only way the non-complementary response works is if it's actually genuine. You can't fake it. And it's that wonderful phrase from section 121 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which talks about power and influence in other people's lives, and it can't be maintained in coercive ways. It can only be done through persuasion, gentleness, and then among that list is this wonderful phrase, love unfeigned. Unfeigned meaning not fake, not pretended. True love, and this ability to truly see the other person and to feel affection for them, to really love our enemy, not to pretend to love our enemy, but to actually love them, is the key to the non-complementary response. You can do and say all sorts of things that seem non-complementary, but if they aren't backed up with actual true non-complementarity, they will fall short. They will ring false. So part of the challenge is for us to actually work at and practice and choose over and over and over again to see the people that we're in conflict with as people. That's the first thing that I would leave with you at the end. The second thing is that the more you begin to understand the art of the non-complementary response, the more you begin to realize its dynamic, the more you will see it in the world. It may feel like the Julio Diaz's of the world are just these rare gems that just don't come along that often. But once you begin looking for it, you'll see it over and over in the scriptures. You'll see it over and over again in life, in history. And you will begin to recognize when it's happening in your own life, when people are responding to you in non-complementary positive ways, and when you are responding to them in non-complementary positive ways, and the ways in which it changes the entire dynamic in the room. I'm a professional mediator, and I get to see this happen often when you've got two people in conflict and you can get them to a place where they can start to see each other. And the minute one of them sees the other and really begins to recognize them and to respond to them as a person, it changes the dynamic completely in the room. It's this magical moment. It's why I love doing mediation. So it's there, it's right in front of us all the time. It's just too often it goes unrecognized and it goes undeveloped in our own lives. So my parting thought to you is to develop, to practice these principles, to find ways to develop them in your own life. And then we will get to, here's the Krister Stendhal quote. Sorry, forgot to put that up there. Find beauty in others so as to develop holy envy. Um, the non-complimentary response was captured beautifully by Martin Luther King, leader of the civil rights movement in the United States, who said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Complimentary responses can't do it. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And then I'll end with one last wonderful quote from Pierre de Chardin, who said, "Someday, after we have mastered space, the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, all of those other forces of the world, we will harness for God the energies of love. And then, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire." When we can train ourselves and learn how to develop love within us, not just wait for it to arrive, but actually cultivate it and develop it within us, so that when faced with the young men with knives that are in our lives in one form or another, and can respond to them in love, then we will have discovered fire, and especially when we can put it onto a large scale, which we didn't really have time to talk about today. But someday there are ways in which we can scale this up to larger societies, not just in our individual lives. But I have a deep faith that love really is the most powerful force in the universe, not just in a kind of hypothetical, mystical, or magical way, but in a very physiological, even physical way. Love really is the force, the strongest force in the universe. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, David. This is Hans again. Eric had to go, so he asked me to mediate.
No problem.
This instance. And of course, I'm sure some of us have questions. I have some. Let me start with one or two. If I look at what we've talked about, you asked the question, what are examples of conflict in your life? I started with the idea of personal conflict, and then we talked about relational conflict. And then we also talked about a little bit about, not much, but about larger conflicts, world conflicts. How do you see this principle that you're talking about on the world stage? We see enormous conflicts at the moment. I'm in human rights. I constantly deal with global conflicts, particularly religious freedom, but I see it everywhere. And of course there are conflicts about opinions, like Russia's opinion about the historical element of Ukraine and how that should be part of it. I can see China saying, if that's the case, then Novosibirsk should be part of our territory, and they're already making statements there for the same argument that Putin used. We have the enormous conflict with Hamas and the Israeli conflict there, and I can name on and on and on. But to what extent would your explanation work on this level? Do you have any experience? Do you have any cases where that may have worked?
Well, I mean, you can, of course, large scale, we do have good examples in terms of the efforts of people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and others. Those tend to be internal conflicts, but they were, of course, large scale ones in which they were training entire armies of people, and they were very kind of military in their approach in terms of discipline and training and planning and so on. Gandhi floated the idea of a nonviolent army to protect India's borders. And in general, I think there are some interesting examples that are out there about people that kind of, because what happens especially in large scale conflicts, is there tends to be this kind of zero-sum approach to things, right? Either this land belongs to us or it belongs to you, and we can't think in terms of shared land, for example, or how that and it either belongs to all of one group or all of another group, and then because there's an assumption that the way that we work this out is to compete over this land. So there's different conflict styles. There's generally five most conflict theories assume there's 5 kinds of style. One's avoiding conflict. One is accommodating conflict, basically just giving in to the other side. The third is competitive approach to conflict, which is I'm going to win, and you have 2 competitors going, that's a war, right? Then you have compromise. Well, let's split the difference. You take half, I'll take half. That's essentially what they did with the Punjab, and when they partitioned India, they gave half of it to Pakistan and half of it to India. But the best conflict style, and the one that is often most and the one that is least often approached, is what's called the problem-solving conflict style, which is, what are our interests here? How can we come up with a solution that works for everyone? And I mean, if you could imagine people really approaching a conflict in that kind of a style, instead of a sense of all or nothing, but and not in a sense of compromise, where can we draw things down the middle, where can we split the difference, but how can we come up with a solution that works, really, really works for everybody? And can we see each other? And part of the challenge is that when we get in that competitive style, it doesn't work very well. But we have some interesting examples. Costa Rica is an interesting example of a country that decided not to fund a military, right? So they decided, we're not going to be in this game of having a military that protects our borders. And they're in one of the most unstable parts of the world, Central America. And yet, since they disbanded their army in 1948 and moved all their money into education, they've never been invaded. It's not like they don't have their problems, but nobody sees them as a threat because they don't have an army, so they don't get attacked. And that's the hardest thing for any country to do, is to say, I'm going to put down our weapons, and we're going to trust the humanity of others because most sides use the other side's military buildup to justify their own military buildup, right? So they never say, I want to build up our army just because nobody else is doing it and we want to do it. They do it because the other side's doing it. And it does take the really brave and dangerous moment of saying, we're not going to do it. And instead, we're going to see if we can figure this out. Now, that can be taken as a sign of weakness by some people, and there's the fear is that that's going to lead to automatically going to lead to an invasion. I think Costa Rica at least gives us an example that doesn't always automatically lead to an invasion.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, it didn't work, though, because during the Second World War, we were neutral.
Right.
And it took us one day to have to capitulate.
Exactly. And yet, and in World War II, the Second World War provides a lot of really other interesting examples, and Danish resistance in terms of slowing work, doing all sorts of things. Bulgaria manages to save all of their Jewish citizens by simply not complying, non-cooperation, right? So that's the classic Gandhian move. It's like, okay, you may take over our country, but we're not going to cooperate with you, which then ultimately makes it an untenable occupation. So I think there's a lot of interesting partial examples for us throughout history, but because we're so trained to think in that competitive mode, we generally don't think that they'll ever going to work. And so people continue to trust in the old way, which time and again has proven itself not to be very effective, or not to be as effective as people think it is. The minute nonviolence fails, people say, see, it doesn't work. But the minute violence fails, people say, well, we just must have got the violence wrong. Let's see if we can figure out a different way to do the violence, and then we'll get it right this time. But it's not that violence is the problem, but the minute that people hold nonviolence and love to a standard of absolute perfection, or else they won't adopt it. Whereas we give all sorts of passes to violence for when it doesn't work. So,
by the way, before I give the time to Grant, because he has a good question, just a comment. I was smiling when I saw your picture of the conflict between the sea and the land. with the rocks and the water, and I thought to myself, how would that play out here in the Netherlands? I think that I think the conflict is seen in mud.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And yeah, the Netherlands is a great example of kind of a creative, I think, a beautifully creative tension between the land and the sea. That's just a part of Dutch identity, right?
Yeah, we build up walls called
Yeah,
dikes.
full up was, yeah, and that's a creative solution, right? Yeah.
Anyway, Grant, do you want to take the time on for your question?
Sure. One of my questions is how does responding to conflict change when there's a power differential between the two parties, whether officially or unofficially, that one is more powerful than the other? Does that change the approach from either perspective who's trying to bring peace?
It's a great question, and it's an important question because there often is a power dynamic. Probably more often there's a power differential. There's a discrepancy, that has to be addressed in one way or another. One of the things that I think is really important is to recognize that when Jesus says love your enemies, he doesn't say let them walk all over you, right? Loving your enemy isn't surrendering to your enemy. The anti-Nephi Lehi's, if you read the story carefully, they're not surrendering. They go out onto the battlefield and they're confronting their attackers. They're not waiting in their homes to be slaughtered. They're going out and meeting them on the battlefield. They're basically creating a human shield, if you will, not in the negative sense of the word. They're using themselves, saying, if you're going to attack our families, you're going to have to come through us. And they're prostrating themselves, but they're not surrendering. They're praying. They're praying for their enemies. They're praying for their families. They're praying for God. And that's a different kind of dynamic, right? They don't have the weapons. There is a power differential here, but they are confronting their enemies in a way that forces their enemies to confront their own violence and to think about what they're doing. And so we could spend a lot of time talking about turning the other cheek and the way in which that is actually not what most people think it means. It's actually standing up to violence and actually putting the opponent in what are in what we call dilemma actions or moral dilemmas, where you're forcing them to choose two things that both recognize your humanity. I'm not really explaining that very well, but Gandhi was the master at doing this, of being able to. They had a dynamic that was imbalanced between the British forces and the people of India. He found ways to constantly use that dynamic in a way that actually forced the British to either acknowledge Indian power or expose their own brutality, and that's the way you work when you've got a power imbalance, is that you're using actually the imbalance in a way that it's what some nonviolent scholars call political jujitsu. You're using the strength of the opponent to actually change the dynamic and work in some ways against the opponent, or at least the harm that they're trying to do. That's not very specific, but it's often people can hear love your enemy and think that means giving in to the enemy, and I just want to make that's not what the point is. You do have to find creative ways to respond when there's a power imbalance that are different because of that imbalance, but it doesn't mean surrendering. It means engaging them with real love, and an acknowledgement of the power dynamic, and figuring out how to make that work to transform it into something more positive.
Before I give the time to Richard, let's turn to Julia, because her question is focused on this element too. Julia, can you explain your question?
So I was wondering about in the case that you're perceived as the strong one, because I think
that at least in social arguments, like social differences, oftentimes there is recently there is quite a lot of social capital if you're being perceived as the weaker one. And so sometimes like the argument is, oh, you're a bully because you are like certain one kind of characteristic that puts you in what is perceived as like being socially stronger. Like, I don't know, oh, but you are in an economic situation that makes it impossible for you to understand me, and so you're privileged. Like, that is the classic word. So how can you like go through that kind of situation? Because usually it just devolves into conflict, and but like in the negative kind of conflict. So do you have any advice on how to like how to make the discussion more sorry, I'm trying to find the term.
Yeah.
More productive. Sorry. Yeah.
That's a great question. One I've wrestled with my whole life as a white male, upper middle class, heterosexual, educated person. I mean, I'm essentially the very definition of privilege that you're talking about, right? That's what I was born into. I can only say that I found there's a wonderful line in the Tao Te Ching about this kind of idea that if there's two countries and one is more powerful than the other, that the more powerful one should take the lower position. And it's the meaning that if we acknowledge the power differential, or we acknowledge the privilege, I have found it to be helpful that I acknowledge that I'm coming from a position in which I don't understand all the time the position that other people have had. That's not been my experience. I have not had to be afraid in certain situations. I have not been disadvantaged because of my most of my life. So just acknowledging that and taking, in a sense, taking the lower position, taking a sense of humility and saying, yeah, it's true, I don't understand this. Help me understand. Explain to me, which is part of that curiosity, right? Why do you believe the way that you do? Help me understand that a little better. That opens the door and is an invitation for the other side to explain their position. And if I can reflect it back to them in a way that they feel like I'm starting to get it, then that invites them to be curious about my own experience and my own philosophies and understanding. That it goes back to that wood principle. If we can be curious, try to understand the side, even if we don't agree with it, but just trying to understand it better, help me to understand, what your experience has been. You're right. It's not been my experience. Help me understand. That has generally gone a long way to diffusing the tension in those kinds of conversations, for me, at least. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you very
Richard,
much.
can you take over?
Yes. My question was, what if your non-complementary response is received as too far-fetched, too surprising, in order that the other concludes it must be fake? So maybe it only works in like a person-to-person conversation and not through the written word, emails or messages or...
That's a great question, because frankly, it is harder to communicate it without being present. So much of communication is nonverbal, and so much of our genuineness is nonverbal. I can say the very same words to one of my children, and if I don't really have a heart at peace, they will know that I don't, and they will know when I do. And it's not because of the words I'm saying, it's because of all the other things they can sense from me in that moment. In our written language, and we live in so much in a world in which we only interact through text. through phones or through emails. I'm sure everybody's had an experience where you've said something and it was perceived completely wrong from what you intended because they didn't hear your tone. They did, for whatever reason. So, we create emojis in part to try to help us with all that nonverbal communication. I don't think they work particularly well. But so when things really matter, face to face is always better. Written communication is likely to be misunderstood or misinterpreted or not seen as genuine, even when it is, because so we just have to continue to try. If there's no other way to communicate, then we just continue to try. But it's the chances are you won't, if you're not believed, you probably won't be believed unless they can really sense that from you in some way. And they probably aren't going to be able to fully sense it unless they're in your presence. I mean, even this video conferencing, even though we can see each other, we still can't feel each other in the same way, feel each other's, presence and spirit in the same way. So, yeah, I'm not sure how to get around. I guess that wasn't a very good answer. I'm not sure how to get around that other than be present if possible.
Yeah, but it helps the understanding. So thank you.
David, do you know the work of Carrie Patterson?
No. Sounds like somebody I should be if you're asking me. So.
Organizational behavior. He wrote a book called Influencer, in which he mentions two elements that you mentioned, the decency hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
He also talks a lot about the idea of why would a decent human being do such a foolish thing? That type of idea.
Right.
And he adds another element, which he says, which he calls the attribution error. So when someone does something not that he's supposed to do, or when someone does something foolish to you, we assume, we attribute to him that it's because he's stupid, because he doesn't want to, because he's trying to harm us. That's why he calls it the attribution error.
Yeah.
And in most cases, we're wrong by attributing these negative elements to such a person.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of wisdom in this whole decency hypothesis that you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, I think hopefully, if we're following that, it mitigates our natural tendencies to misunderstand one another. Yeah. I found as a rule, most people are decent people and they're trying to do the right thing. And if they're doing something that doesn't make sense to me, if I can just pause and think, okay, why would a person who's trying to do the right thing do what they just did? And that does help significantly.
In the wood principle that you mentioned, creating their strongest arguments, so to speak, from their point of view. How about in order to create that? How about interviewing them in a very fair way to give them let's call it the benefit of the doubt? Is that your experience too, or do you have experience with that maybe?
Yeah, I think that gets to that curiosity, right? When we're genuinely curious about other people and genuinely want to understand why they're thinking the way they do, then the kinds of questions that we will ask them will be, they won't be asked in a spirit that is, because sometimes we're asking questions about people and they think, oh, they're just trying to trap me, right? They're just they're curious about this because they're trying to find ammunition to use against me. But if we are genuinely curious about other people and want to know, then those questions don't come across that way. They come across as genuine questions of trying to understand. And again, so much of it comes down to how we're seeing them. If we really are seeing them as people with hopes and dreams and fears and that are just as real as my own hopes and dreams and fears, and that I'm just curious to try to understand how those are configured in their own life, the very same word as I would ask without that will be interpreted much more positively. So, yeah.
Why is it that we Latter-day Saints, particularly in America, I should say, are are so much focused on competition.
Mm-hmm.
If what Jesus seems to be teaching is learning from each other and loving one another's enemy, seems to almost be the opposite. So why is it that this whole this attitude of competition is so relevant for us?
Well, I think you hit on probably the cause of it. You said in America, and American culture is extraordinarily competitive, and has this tendency towards a competitive view of the world rather than a cooperative view of the world. Or if you cooperate to compete. And
competition.
Yeah. So I think as a whole, Latter-day Saints swimming in that world, and when it's being reinforced, just constantly through the media, through films and literature and everything else, and it just becomes this water that we swim in that we don't even realize that we're swimming in it, and then it begins to shape our sense of our own theology, our doctrine, our values, and it's one of the reasons why, for example, the principle of Zion for American Saints, often they have to, if you really start talking about what Zion looks like and what it means to have all things in common and so on, that really rubs against a lot of Latter-day Saints in the United States, because they've grown up with Adam Smith and competition and the way that blesses everybody, and so they get beyond they can't get outside of that kind of competitive model of economies and the world and so on. So yeah, I would just say it's American culture.
Zion is against that religion.
Yeah, so sometimes I think we as Latter-day Saints in America tend to fight against our own doctrine, because we have imbibed so much of American. We've drunk from that well so frequently that we don't even realize how it's shaping our own interpretation of Scripture and the way it shapes our values. That's why I think in the end, and some of the saddest social science research I've seen in the last few decades is the way that political identity is a much, much stronger indicator of people's worldviews than their religious identity. And at least, especially in the United States, and so that the people's communities, their political communities, have become more important than their religious communities to them.
That's not only in America, though. That's typical.
Yeah,
that's typical.
I would hope that our membership in the kingdom of God is our primary identity, but time and again, we see that other identities are becoming much, much more important. So
yeah, like I always say, I'm a Calvinistic Mormon because I'm living in the Netherlands, even though I'm fourth generation.
Yeah,
and it's hard to get out of it because you're raised in that culture and it's part of your identity, and it's very difficult to get out. Richard, you had a comment?
Oh yeah, I was just saying when we as Western Europeans colonized the American continent, we should have learned more from the Native Americans there in how they lived and how they shared. But that was just a thought.
Very good. Yeah. Although competition was also part of their culture as well with the other groups. But yeah, there's so much we could learn from Native. I did Native American an emphasis in my graduate work in Native American history. So I came to really deeply appreciate what that could have meant if there had been a more cooperative approach. Yeah, I just think that if we really read our scriptures, and especially the words of Jesus, with any degree of earnestness and seriousness, we find that Jesus is constantly challenging our cultural paradigms, and if we're not uncomfortable with what he's inviting us to do, then we're probably not reading deep enough. If it's not challenging us to rethink our culturally inherited values in wherever we may be living, then we're not really reading Jesus, and we're not letting that voice call us to something higher. What I love when I'm at my best as a reader and as a disciple, I am in a state of constant discomfort with my own with what my own behavior and values, and I'm being called out of that into something better, so something much better, or the more excellent way that Paul and Moroni talk about.
Well, this has been very helpful for us, I think. We've learned to see the whole concept of conflict from different angles now. And we've looked at how to use it in our lives in a more practical way. I think we have some excellent tips on how to do this. Now it's time to put it in practice, which is the hard part, I imagine. I think one of the elements that you mentioned in closing is the idea that conflict is part of our teaching, right? Lehi talks about it, and it's all over the scriptures. We don't want to get rid of conflict. We want to be able to deal with conflict somehow and make it work for us. And that is a completely different mindset from what you see in many other religions who are trying to get rid of conflict, even stepping out of this world and spiritualizing everything to solve it. Thank you so much for your wisdom, for your sharing your thought, your time, and us for getting to know you in this way. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. This has been really just a joy. It's been a pleasure and fun to see old faces and to be introducduced to new ones. So thank you so much. I actually have to get to my class now, and starts in 6 minutes. So,
do you mind if we have a closing prayer just quickly? Julia, can I ask you to? I mean, I didn't ask you before, but is it appropriate to ask you?
Me? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we had together to listen to guide to David Pulsipher's guidance and advice on how we can understand conflict better. We ask you to guide us in our daily lives so that we may follow this advice, and we say this in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Julia. Appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.